Here with Brian Hamm, new head coach at Yale, but ABCA A-Tech Division III Coach of the Year. Just won a national championship with Eastern Connecticut. 49-3 record, so impressive. So Brian, thanks for jumping on with me.
Absolutely. And thanks for being a part of that. It was enjoyable to talk with you at the College World Series and to see you and so many coaches who are involved with the ABCA and on some level. The Eastern team, myself, our coaching staff are really appreciative for everything that the ABCA, the NCAA did to allow for the World Series experience to be first class for our staff, our players, and our fans. It was a truly special experience.
Have you had a chance to catch your breath at all?
This week is the first week to be able to do that for me personally. Uh, the run in the Ncaa tournament and then the World Series was certainly a lot of work, but the NCAA changing the format for Division III to go to the regional, super regional College World Series format, similar to Division I, is just a much healthier experience for the coaches and for the players to get away from that 6 or 8 team regional format. Which now that we look back at it and see, how the Division I teams have been doing it, you look back and you see the 8 team regional and you think, what were we what were we doing? That's crazy. And then after the World Series, having the opportunity to celebrate that back at Eastern and in Connecticut, and then to transition to Yale, and then to get on the road recruiting and assemble our coaching staff has been a lot. So this week, finally, things are settling down. I'm back on campus and figuring out our fall schedule and some of the taking care of some of the office needs that I need to do.
When you got to Eastern, I mean, it looks like you got Len Reed, Chris Wojcik, Steve Cervisi, Ismail Bolarin. They all had ties to Eastern Connecticut.
Yes.
I mean, how many of those guys were there, and how many guys did you bring back when you took over?
Yes. So Steve Cervisi was the only coach who was with Coach LeBranch prior to me arriving, and Steve has a long history of success in college baseball, dating back to coaching with Coach Holowati, and then he spent time with Coach Decker, who's now at Harvard, and was a part of the team that went 45-1 and won the national championship with Trinity. And then he went back to Eastern to coach with Matt, and then stayed on with me. Len Reed, who was Eastern's first All-American, was a two-sport player and athlete at Eastern. And he has, to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, the most national championships of anyone in college baseball, since he had the four under Coach Holowati and then the one this past year. I could be wrong. Maybe there are probably some people at Marietta who have 5 or yelling at the screen saying, wait, no, I've got 6. But he certainly has 5 rings, which is quite a lot. So he rejoined the staff after my first year, and then Chris and I coached against each other when he was at Wesleyan and I was at Amherst. We went together at Eastern, and now we're together at Yale.
I mean, was it a no-brainer to keep Steve on? I mean, with that amount of experience, was it a no-brainer? Because I think all coaches that take over programs run into that a little bit. You may have an assistant that's already there. How do you know when to keep a guy, or maybe when it's time to bring somebody new in?
Certainly, Steve and I knew each other from when I was at Amherst, and he was at Trinity and then Eastern coaching against us. And he has such an outstanding reputation for who he is as a person, and his knowledge and experience as a coach, and the institutional knowledge that he brought, having been at Eastern, that it was a nice transition for the players who were there prior to me arriving, to then the coaching staff that we assembled and the new players that came in as first years.
He's fiery too. I mean, I appreciate the fact that he's got a lot of energy in games.
He is. As a matter of fact, he and I had a run in when I was at Amherst, and I get along pretty much with everyone. And to this day, I still take pride in the fact that I haven't been ejected from a game. But Steve, when Steve was at Amherst coaching with Trinity, and I had a disagreement, and I always remind him of that because he is fiery, but he is such a um, just a humble and wonderful person in terms of he coaches from the heart, and people love him. As a matter of fact, he was recognized by the New England Baseball Coach Association as the assistant coach of the year this year in New England, for not only his reputation but for the way that he coaches and interacts with the players. His charisma, his energy is outstanding. Len Reed, the same thing, in terms of establishing the bench culture that we had this year and then carrying out into the field as our first base coach. Both Len and Steve made a major difference in terms of who we are as a team and the personality that we developed as a team.
And I saw Coach Baylock on
Yes,
staff. That's
yes,
unbelievable. That's something I didn't know. Obviously, I had Lefty Gomez Award winner, coached forever at UConn, and legendary
yes.
coach at UConn forever.
He is, and he is a member of 8 Hall of Fames, which is quite impressive, and is a testament to his career. And he's still involved at UConn fundraising for the football team. But when I arrived at Eastern, he reached out to me and asked if he could continue to throw batting practice,
Yep.
because he takes a lot of pride in the
Yes, he
amount of
does.
batting practice that he throws, not only for Eastern, but he throws for Norwich when the Navigators were in town, and now for the Futures League team. He throws every day in the summer. And so when he came to me and asked me that, I said, Coach, we'd love to have you on our coaching staff. That's the minimum for you to throw batting practice. So we brought him on as a special advisor, but he became much more than that. He came to all of our practices, watched all of our games from up top in the grandstand, and then gave us feedback. But the players really fell in love with Coach Baylock, and there was such a special relationship between he and the players this year. It was really special to watch, and again, we benefited to have Len Reed, a Hall of Famer and All-American, Steve Cervisi, now a 2-time national championship with a 45-1 record and a 49-3 record, and then Andy Baylock with everything that he had to bring to the table with his experience. He's 84 years old and oftentimes showed more energy than some of the guys at practice. And then Chris Wojcik, who I think is certainly one of the young, bright pitching minds in the game at any level. And he's done a lot with Josh McDonald at UConn, who everyone knows the quality of knowledge and pitching coach that he is, and what he and Coach Penders and their staff, Jeff Horgan, have done with the UConn baseball staff. So Chris has really brought much to my knowledge of pitching. I started learning from Bill Thurston, pitching legend, and certainly somebody who's involved in the ABCA, New England baseball, at Amherst. So we were really fortunate to have an outstanding coaching staff, and then with Ish Bolarin and Eric Carlson to round out the staff. That had a lot to do with kind of cultivating the team that we had on the field, and ultimately the personality. I talk a lot about the personality that we had as a team. That was certainly something that made a difference throughout the season and into the playoffs.
With Coach Baylock, after he watches a game, what are some of the notes that he brings down?
So that's a really good question, because with the wealth of knowledge that he has over 50 years in the game, he had some insight that oftentimes would be missed by the coaches or the leaders on the team. And that ranged everything from how players carried themselves in the dugout or on and off getting on and off the field, to noticing little things on the field. Because so he would sit, our grandstand's pretty high, and he would sit at the topmost bleacher looking down. So he had a very different vantage point than the coaches. So it had everything to do with just general body language that the players showed, to how they interacted, to then also doing a good job of communicating what he saw at practice to then how we performed in the game. And then just a general perspective, which was different than myself and Chris Wojcik, in terms of what he saw at UConn or what he was seeing in the game elsewhere, or just a historical perspective of we had made a run last year and unfortunately got stymied with a walk-off in our conference championship to Southern Maine. And then we lost our first 2 games in the Ncaa tournament. But prior to that, we made this really exciting run. And he provided the perspective of during that run, for him, it was some of the most exciting sports that he ever watched. in his career, let alone in baseball. And that UConn had some, certainly some amazing seasons during his time against St. John's and some of the other Big East teams. So for him to say that, certainly, I think for our players gave them perspective of what a special team we had last year, and then that helped galvanize us with the confidence to be successful this year and to go into the season with that confidence and to build on it.
Yeah, Brian Albee, Luke Broadhurst were ABCA
Yes.
All-Americans. But, you just look at the stats. You hit 338 as a team, 103 doubles, 99 stolen bases, 293 team ERA. I mean, coming into the season, what did you feel like your strengths were going to be?
Well, we felt that our strengths going into the season was the experience that we had from the previous season. And like I said, we had put together a really successful year. I mean, we were essentially, when we finished 32-8, we had we had 4 losses at the end of the regular season. And then, things ended really abruptly. And so that experience for us, combined with having been together through COVID, which many teams obviously had been through, but Eastern Connecticut did a great job allowing for us to get back to the field, get back to summer ball that June after COVID. And so we really felt that our biggest strength was the experience that we had, and that we had finally, now this was our third year together as a team, had finally put in place the offensive, defensive pitching systems, both in practice and in games, with the experienced players in that system, and then the talent that we had to really serve as the foundation for potential success this year. And then on top of that, we brought in some transfers who transitioned really well into our team culture. And if you look back at our team, it was a mix of transfer players who brought different perspectives. We had a player the previous year from Wake Forest, Holden White, who's now coaching at Brown. We had Ryan Bagdasarian from UConn. We had Ty Benicasso from UConn. We have Luke and Donahue, all players who were core to this success this year. And then we also had some players from Franklin Pierce, transfer from Tampa, all programs that had and have had tremendous success in the recent years, that they brought that to our team culture with the players that had arrived as first years. So we were fortunate, again, going back to the coaching staff and a veteran coaching staff, to be able to put it all together and make it work, because that's not to bring in so many transfers who played right away is not an easy transition in teams of team culture and buy-in. But for the players who are in the program to accept that and understand that bringing in players even mid-year to help us be successful was a part of what our mission was as a team.
Yeah, I mean, how do you pull the trigger on that with a mid-year guy?
Out of need. And we were very clear right out of the gate as a coaching staff that our objective was to get Eastern back to a World Series. And we were upfront with players and communicating to them, the players that were in the program when we arrived and the ones that we were recruiting, that part of that drive was that the best players who were going to help the team in that moment would play. And in many ways, being upfront with that out of the gate allowed for players to understand that that's how it was going to be. And if they want to be a part of the program, that they need to be on board with that. But it really manifested into a really healthy competitive environment for players. And ultimately, I think one of the biggest strengths of our national championship team was the fact that there were players who were willing to sacrifice their playing time for the betterment of the team. And that didn't necessarily mean that they weren't well suited to go into the game and perform. It was just that we were on a run and tear at the end where we didn't lose in either our league tournament or the NCAA tournament. We had a 23-game win streak. And that was partially because we decided to kind of ride the hot hand at the time. And so, for example, we had Nate Farino, an all New England pitcher last year, who didn't pitch down the stretch just because of kind of the rotation that we were in. And yet in the dugout, in the locker room, at practice, he was always somebody who was pushing his teammates, but always working really, really hard to better himself, and wasn't rewarded by pitching on the field. But in the end was rewarded by us winning a national championship. And that was the type of team that we had.
Yeah, April 23rd was your last loss.
Yes.
which I mean, I'm doing some digging, and I'm like, oh wow, they didn't lose after April 23rd. Pretty much the same lineup. Once you got hot, pretty
Yes.
much rolling the same lineup out there, same guys on the mound.
Yes, and we tweaked our lineup a little bit to protect some players and to give some players a booster to see different pitches, and that actually those adjustments worked really well. But on the whole, it was essentially the same starting lineup in same rotation from the last 2 weeks of the regular season on through the College World Series. Um, and we
But you
got
did
into
use a lot of guys. I mean, when you look at
we
your
did.
stats, I mean, so early on, you were given multiple guys opportunities to get in there. I mean, you look at a lot of position players had ABs, and a lot of pitchers had
Mhm.
innings.
Yes, and we talk as a team about being prepared for those opportunities. And oftentimes it was more difficult for those players who came off the bench to prepare and ultimately perform in those moments because, as we all know with baseball performance is oftentimes about rhythm. And about, for hitters, the timing mechanism of seeing velocity or seeing secondary pitches and adjusting to them, and then pitchers for them getting into a normal pitching routine. So for those players to come off the bench or to come out of the pen at odd times, not being in the starting lineup and performing, if you look back at our season, one of our biggest successes in the regular season were those players who came in pitch hit situations, or those pitchers who came in after not having thrown for 2 weeks and getting the job done. It's actually one of the more impressive things about our team this year. If you look at those stats and the performance of those pinch opportunities, whether it was hit or throwing, pitching, it's a testament to how we practiced and our mental game, the inner game sport performance approach for players to stay prepared to be ready for those moments.
I mean, dive in that a little bit deeper on keeping role guys sharp, because that's not an easy thing. But you're gonna need them at some point. How are you keeping those guys sharp?
Certainly, a lot of it is in practice and communicating with players their value to the team and finding roles for them and them finding roles for themselves and embracing those roles. Um, and the way that we practice our pre-pitch or pre-at-bat um, performance. So we talk a lot about awareness and presence, whether it's at practice or in games or in the classroom or just in life in general. And we practice that preparation to be present in the moment. So that way, whether it's a starter in the lineup in the game speeds up on them, they're able to step back and recognize that the game is speeding up on them and make an adjustment. Or if they're on the bench and they come into the game, they're called to a pinch hit opportunity, and they hadn't had an at bat all weekend. That presence and awareness of paying attention to the game and preparing themselves both mentally and physically would give them or put them in the best position to succeed in that moment. And we were able to do that, and that translates to ultimately performing under pressure situations, whether it was in the regional against Middlebury. I mean, we were down 2 runs with 2 outs and 2 strikes on Donahue against Goldstein, who was the pitcher of the year in the Ncaa, and actually is just he's Futures League All-Star this summer in the Futures League, arguably the best pitcher in that league this year. And we went, double, home run, single, double, game over. And a lot of that, again, is a testament to what we do from an inner game perspective for preparation for those times when the game speeds up or you're called for a pitch hit opportunity.
What techniques are you teaching them, breathing wise and then visualization wise?
So a lot of it has to do with awareness of what the body and mind are feeling and doing in that moment, and it's based in centering through the breathing mechanism. Because if you can pay attention to your breath, it forces you to pay attention to being present in that moment, and then you can start to begin to understand what your body is feeling, what your mind is doing, and then make adjustments from there. And that helps with our practice development as well. And that if we can recognize when we are making mistakes or we have some mechanical fault, then we can make the adjustment. But it's not until we can recognize that there is a fault before we can start to address it. And you can't do that unless you have awareness about yourself. So yeah, it starts with the centering mechanism which we do through breathing.
How long does it take your guys to kind of figure that piece out? Because that was something we spent a lot of time with our guys on as well, but it took some guys longer to figure that piece out or even buy into it.
Well, it starts with the coaching staff buying into it, right, and managing themselves. And I think probably the thing that I learned the most this year as a coach is how to manage myself. But for the coaching staff to buy into the centering practice and routines, and then for them to kind of lead the players through that practice to eventually get player buy-in. And it takes a long time because it's so counter to how we teach and coach in this country, or anything that we do in our society, in terms of just taking a second to pause, step back, and pay attention to what our body is telling us. And when our players begun to practice it and then see it help them perform better is when we started to get buy-in. But that took multiple seasons. And then for other players to be doing, some of our better players to be doing it, for the other players to buy in.
Were you using it as a player? I mean, you're a two-sport athlete in college. Were you using any sort of centering in as a player?
I was not. I had no awareness to it. And not until my senior year, Middlebury had a visiting coach, Jeff McKay, come in and work with players on that. And then I've actually had Jeff work with our athletes at Amherst and at Eastern as well. And I've learned a lot from him in terms of that. So it wasn't until my senior year at Middlebury.
We talked about in Cedar Rapids about learning from different cultures, and that's a Far East concept.
Yes, it is
centering and breathing. It just comes with their culture. And you just talk about how important it was for you to go overseas and see different cultures, experience different cultures.
Well, I first begun to pay attention to their approach from watching Ichiro, and understanding that he was playing at a different level, on a mental level. And I don't like to talk about it from a mental perspective because the mind and the body are so intertwined that it's more visceral than anything, and especially at academic institutions that I've been a part of. Oftentimes we spend so much time talking about everything from the neck up in terms of performance. And it's too easy, especially at a place like Amherst or Yale, to forget that we live our lives, yes, in our head, but also in our bodies. And so to see Ichiro be able to combine the two, and then that led me to read more about Sadahara O and his legacy within the game, that we often don't see in the United States. But I mean, essentially, he's in Japan, they would say Babe Ruth is the Sadahara O of baseball, right? And for him to be able to hit from that batting stance, and to be such a prolific hitter, told me that there was something well beyond his physical abilities that made him the special player that he was. So then when we took the Amherst team to Japan, we learned so much more. Again, I had mentioned about the relationship between the self and the community, but also that discipline that one needs to have in terms of being present and aware in the moment, which we then brought to the Amherst team, and in Eastern certainly had it last year, and that I hope to bring to Yale.
Different training model in the Far East as well as from a practice standpoint. They practice for hours.
Oh, yes.
It's more of a prep model where it's if they're playing baseball, they're playing baseball all day, every day.
Yes, and again, I've mentioned the word presence multiple times, but it's that the ability to be present in the moment, and to bring that passion during that time, so they don't go through the motions for the 4+ hour long practices. I mean, those practices are highly organized, where they have multiple. I mean, they'll have a batting practice where there are 4 hitters hitting on the field with 4 batting practice pitchers, and if you are not paying attention as a hitter, as a batting practice pitcher, or a fielder, you're going to get killed. And it forces their players to be present and ultimately to pay attention. And one of the things that I felt that our Eastern team did so well this year is the ability to bring their passion, their joy for the game, their energy to every single pitch. Not that our opponents weren't doing that, but we just did that really well this year.
Yeah, that's something that's a skill, to be able to do that as a player, and especially in this generation of kids where their attention span's so short. I mean, are you doing other things with that, or is that just something that your guys had innately with, getting there, recruiting or whatever? Is that just something that your guys had innately, or is that something you're spending time with?
So it's a conscious decision by our coaching staff, because one of the things that I've noticed since COVID is the need to provide an enjoyable environment for our athletes, for our players. And one of the things that I learned from Coach Thurston when I was coaching with him was that you need to find joy in the game from the monotonous, work that baseball requires to develop skill. The rote routine practice in drilling skill development. And that's important. You have to appreciate and love that. And that certainly develops a certain level of character. But what I've also found with this generation of college baseball player, and you could say this about the high school players and probably youth below that, is the need to provide an environment where they are excited to show up to the field. And if you watch the All-Star game, one of the things that I really enjoyed about watching the game this year is what a great job Major League Baseball did to provide an experience for the young fan to relate to the current young major leaguers. And then also to give us access to some of the older players, to include David Ortiz, who was doing the sideline reporting while the game was going on, or to include John Smoltz from the broadcast booth into the conversations with the players. They did an outstanding job connecting the generations of the game to be more in line with what I feel the NBA and the NFL are a little ahead of baseball at this moment in terms of relating to what the younger fan wants and how the younger baseball player relates to the game. And I think as coaches, and certainly with many of the older guard coaches who are part of the ABCA and involved in the game now, one of the biggest challenges for us is to accept that the game is changing and that it needs to change, and that many of these changes are good for the long-term well-being of the game and continuing to get younger players to play. And whether that's, I realize, for example, for me when I was growing up, and probably for you too, it was Griffey wearing his hat backward, right? And that the argument of whether or not that was showing disrespect to the game, or if that was just now how the game was at that time. And you could say the same thing about many of the aspects of the game now, whether it's the bat flip or it's the players interacting on the field together, or what, the bright colored sneakers or the new bats that you're seeing. That's all really good for the game because it doesn't change anything in terms of our commitment to how we play it. And so one of the things that we did really well as a coaching staff this year is to kind of just let the players enjoy being who they are and play the game how they've kind of grown up with it and what they see on television. And
you got to allow them to bring their personality into it now.
To bring their personality into it.
You got to allow them to have their individual
Yes.
personality. It doesn't take away from what you're doing on the field or in between the
Right.
white lines. They've got to be able to express their personality, and that's part of getting buy-in with this generation as well. Is like, okay,
Yes.
we're not nitpicking on what you're dressing like and what you look like and all that. We're not going to nitpick on that. We're just going to let you do your thing. As long as you're giving effort on the field and playing hard and
Yes.
all that, go do it with the other stuff.
Absolutely, because that doesn't, to me, and to our team at Eastern, and we'll carry on, what John Stuper has done at Yale in terms of this. You show respect to the game and the umpires and the fans and your opponents by the way that you play the game, the way that you interact with them, the way that you accept the calls that are being made on the field. And as long as our players were running hard on and off the field, or running hard 90s, or respecting their opponents, these new changes to the game in terms of how it's being played at the major league level with some of the young talent. I don't see it. I mean, matter of fact, I think it's refreshing in a way. And it's really good for the game. And I really applaud Major League Baseball for what they did with the All-Star game this year. And I think we as coaches at the college level really need to embrace that and celebrate it, because that's what our youth want. And if that allows for them to play the game with more passion and more people play the game itself, that's a really good thing.
Yeah. I loved that they're mic'd up because you can hear their self-talk. Yeah. And that's the thing that I thought was the best part of all of that. Yes, they have talent, but their self-talk is elite. They have elite self-talk. And that's how you see in those pressure situations, the way that they're talking to themselves and how they execute, you can see that's how they execute, is because their self-talk was positive. It was external. It was, okay, I'm going to do this. There was no self-doubt in any of their self-talk. And that's what I felt like was the best part of that, is the communication with the catcher and the pitcher, but listening to them talk to themselves. Because I think every elite performer has really good self-talk in the moment and stays positive in the moment with things going on.
Yes. And again, going back to if this was even 5 years ago, there certainly would have been people who said, how dare baseball disrespect the game to be doing this in the middle of an all-star game. Yeah. And yet think about the access that it provides you and me and the young players to learn from the game, of everything that you just said. We now have access to that. And one of the beauties of growing up being an athlete, a youth athlete today, is the ability to learn from the access that you have now to technology and video and television that, you and I certainly didn't have in just watching the game. And so, the access is tremendous now.
You talked about Coach Thurston. I mean, how do you know? I mean, you've picked right along the way with the schools that you've coached at. I mean, how do you know that along your journey? For a young coach listening in, how do you know how to pick right? Because you've surrounded yourself with successful programs and successful people.
I have. I've been really fortunate. And that started with, where I grew up in my town. And my grandfather, both of my grandfathers were very instrumental in baseball in our town, and our Little League and softball fields are named after them. So they started the Little League and the Babe Ruth League. I'm fortunate to I have 10 boy cousins, all the same age, and one girl cousin who held her own in all of the wiffle ball games and pickup games that we had. So that's where I got my passion. And, I'm also really fortunate that they had tremendous success. One of them became a 3-time Olympian and in sports. And then my family members were all coaches. So that gave me the insight to search for that when I was an athlete. I ended up at Middlebury and learned under outstanding coaches up there, not only in baseball, but the soccer coach who won a national championship, Dave Sayward, who I talked to the other day, who's a mentor of mine. And the coaches up there, with Aaron Quinn being the director of athletics there. I learned a lot about the value of learning from quality people. And so that then fostered, kind of my understanding of how you learn as a coach. And that's ultimately from the people you associate yourself with. And again, I mentioned that you can read and you can go online, and we have access to all this information now that you could only have gotten back in the day from books or, the one nationally televised baseball game. But I really do believe it still is the people that we learn the most from, both in terms of how we carry ourselves, but the knowledge that they carry. And so when I was at Middlebury, for my next step, I knew that I need to learn pitching. And so I actually just searched out the best pitching coach out there, in the Northeast. And that was Bill Thurston. And I was fortunate to not only be there to learn under him for 4 years, but to be around Kelly Swinney, who's now a college coach, Kevin Graber, who's one of the best high school coaches. He's at Phillips Academy Andover and produces, Power 5 guys every year out of that program. Brian Adamski, who's the head coach at Trinity in Connecticut now. Mike Armstrong, who's now the head coach at Alfred State. I mean, Joe Hallmacher, who I coached with, is now in the Orioles organization. Mike Oldenwalder's at Dartmouth. I learned from all of these people, having been at Amherst, partially because Bill Thurston had brought so many people together because of his knowledge and passion for the game. And then at Eastern, again, I was just fortunate to be around such outstanding coaches and have the ability to bring them all together. And I think as coaches, that the most powerful thing that we can do as a head coach is to recognize how much we have to learn and learn from other coaches that we can surround ourselves by, and then also learn from our players. The Eastern baseball team was so knowledgeable in what our players brought to the field, into the game itself, that toward the end of the season, my responsibility was just to stay out of everybody's way, because we had such knowledge, like just baseball knowledge, from our players, that we would talk lineup, we would talk strategy, we'd let the guys be involved in those decisions, because we had so many players from UConn or Franklin Pierce or Tampa or Wake Forest, and then we had the players in the program who were so knowledgeable, who came up out of great high school programs. Why not use all of that collective knowledge together? So I've always, looked to other people to learn from the game, and that certainly made a difference in terms of my teaching style and ultimately the strategy that we use on field.
Is that by design, getting players from winning programs? Because
Yes.
I agree, because I feel like a player that's been in a winning program understands roles. You may not get on the field all the time. They understand competing to get on the field all the time. That's by design?
Oh, absolutely. Is one of the factors that we look in the recruiting process, that we identify players coming out of successful high school programs, because assumably they've learned from outstanding high school coaches, and not only have developed a skill base, but also an understanding of what it takes to develop and to win. And then again, in UConn and the success that they've had in the Northeast, starting with the coaches before, Coach Penders and Coach Baylock certainly was a big part of that. But what Jim Penders has done, not only with his staff, which by the way are all UConn guys, and they take a lot of pride in that, but the quality of the person that they bring into that program, and then the talent that they bring, now with the new facility that they have, to have the players from that program to come down the street, we're only 5 miles down the road, meant a lot to the success that we had this year.
And with your analytics team, they're helping shorten that learning curve, correct?
Yes. So I started an analytics team when I was at Amherst, and if you follow the tracks of where they've ended up,
it's a lot of names.
It's a lot of names. I had mentioned when we talked at the World
Cedar
Series,
Rapids,
but
you dive in on the website and you look, it's like, oh wow, that's a lot of people.
Oh yes, and I'd forgotten Jason Stein, who's with the Mets organization. But there are at least 5. As a matter of fact, I'm talking to Ryan Hardin this evening about what they're doing in the Orioles organization. Mike Elias is a Yale baseball alum and general manager now of the Orioles, and they had a great start to the first half of the major league season. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, what have you been doing with the Orioles organization? And Ryan Hardin was with me at Amherst, and he's now on the analytics staff with the Orioles. And I mentioned Joe Hallmacher, who's on the pitching staff on the minor league organization with the Orioles. The number of people that have come out of Amherst and Eastern and Yale that are now in the pro ranks, not only just playing. We had Mike Walsh drafted in the draft in the 9th round out of Yale this year. But in the front office and analytics and the scouting departments of major league organizations is really impressive, especially coming out of Amherst, where 1,700 students, and at one point 10% of all major league GMs had played baseball at Amherst. I mean, that's a really impressive stat.
And the people that are in those positions, have you communicated much or asked many questions about what they felt like maybe would work from a data standpoint, but have shifted, or is it still the same? Have they shifted over time with maybe some of the analytics stuff that they're using?
It shifts so fast. Yeah. And I think if we look at Major League Baseball, one of the most interesting things to me over the past decade is how quickly the game changes. Within seasons, that if your front office is not attuned to how the game is changing, what other teams are doing, you're left in the dark through the course of a season. It used to be decades, and then not too long ago it was, well, okay, they hadn't been paying attention for a couple of years. Now it's the game has changed so quickly, and the challenge for us is how do we then take advantage of the resources, being at Yale and the outstanding resources that we have, to make sure that we are ahead of the curve at the college level when we're especially going up against the Power 5 schools that also have their own resources. And so one of the things that I've done is reached out to our Yale network, my Amherst alumni network, that are in the game, to understand what they're doing, so that way we can replicate that at Yale in real time, because the game changes so fast now that we have to be ahead of the curve.
And I think you see it in the draft, what they value. You look at the position
Yes.
players that were drafted this year, it's more back-to-ball skills. So you can see that, okay, they're starting to see that putting the ball in play is coming back. It has more value.
Yes.
You look at the team that wins the Major League Baseball World Series every year. It's the team that strikes out the least. So
Yes.
that was interesting for me, because you saw some guys taken early this year that you maybe wouldn't have seen in the past, that have lower strikeout numbers, putting the ball in play. So maybe is that Major League Baseball figuring out that, okay, contact still has some value, as opposed to a guy like a Joey Gallo who's going to strike out one out of every 2 times. Is that
Well, being a Yankee fan, the strikeout ratio of Gallo to balls in play drives me crazy.
This is interesting. I go to a lot of events, and so I have old scouting friends that are still in it, and had a really good, interesting conversation with a buddy of mine that I've known for a long time. He said there's never been a college position player that has made it to the big leagues whose swing and miss rate in college was above 20%. It's never happened. So that's barrier of entry. Mm-hmm. From a stat standpoint, but he said, yes, he mentioned Gallo and Stanton. Gallo's his senior year of high school was the first year they kept max prep stats.
Okay.
He struck out 30% in high school. Gallo did. So it just shows you there's a guy that struck out a lot in high school, going to strike out a ton at the big league level.
Yes. Yes.
So those are the things that people don't realize from the outside looking in. They're drafting and taking guys now because historically there's going to be some numbers that stick out for a guy whether they make it or not. So it's interesting that goes into it. And this is also why you can't pay attention to the draft, because they have so much information at their hands to cross guys off that your local player who tears up their local league, they're going to look at all those things and be like, well, this isn't going to allow them to make it.
Yes. And one of the things I think is very difficult for high school coaches to appreciate is the amount of information that we have at the college level.
Yes.
Because we have access to essentially all of the information that the major league teams now have. And as a result, we have access to that information on our players and our opponents, and to understand what drives performance at our level and ultimately at the next level. And one of the outcomes of the downsized draft is we're starting to better understand what the major league teams identify as projectors for success at that level, which then can also inform us of how we choose to recruit at the college level. And ultimately is going to then impact the game and how it's played at the highest level of high school baseball. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. We'll find out, because you see in the draft, major league teams will draft a pitcher on one specific pitch, or the potential to throw one specific pitch, and then develop the rest of them. And again, it goes back to how the game has changed, in sport in this country has changed and gravitated towards specialization. And it had gravitated towards specialization within a single sport. And now it's gravitating to specialization within a skill set within a sport. And again, that's not good or bad. It's just how we evolve and how sports evolves. And certainly it's a fascinating thing about baseball. I was just listening to a podcast. I think it was, it wasn't Malcolm Gladwell podcast. It was an interview with Bill James. And he was talking about his career in baseball, and specifically the latter part of his career with the Red Sox and his involvement in Major League Baseball, kind of post the Moneyball excitement. And he was asked the question, um, if he felt that he had more questions now at this point in his career than he did at the start, and he said he has so many more questions because the game has changed so much. So
Well, in
I thought
technology too, there was a great article last week that came out with Major League Baseball about the Hawkeye and now the amount of information they're getting on the swing and the
yes,
pre stuff with barrel angle, contact, we still have more room for growth, which is cool because the technology is
yes,
continuing to get better to tell the actual story on the field that we could never get this information in the past, like efficiency routes in the outfield, efficiency routes in the infield, where the barrel's at in space. Like we're going
yes.
to continue to get so much more information to break down the small parts of playing the game.
Yes, and I think that's going to be a strength for the game of baseball, to drive interest at the youth level again. And we talk about that as a concern of ours in terms of competing with other sports. For example, let's say lacrosse in this area was really taken hold in youth sports. That we can then excite a new generation of athlete to baseball because of the access that they have to this information that other sports may not generate or may not be as caught up on with where baseball is in that. So somebody, a stat geek that has an interest in all of this may continue to be a part of the game, maybe not through playing it, but show passion for it and continue to be a fan because of the access that they have that comes from Major League Baseball down through the college ranks, and then eventually is going to end up in the hands of high school coaches.
When did you know Jordan Tabakman was going to be a good coach?
Jordan Tabakman.
Yeah.
Uh, when when he arrived at Amherst, he'd started his career at North Carolina, and then transferred to UConn, and he played in the Cape, and then coached for Harvey Shapiro with Bourne at the Cape. And at that time, I was recruiting him to be my pitching coach. At that time, the Amherst baseball field was to say that it was a high school field would have been generous. We didn't have dugouts. We had just regular benches. Our backstop was literally falling down. The Amherst baseball field is in the center of campus, and it's a historic field because two presidents have landed on the field with, whatever the helicopter one is. And John F. Kennedy spoke there. So Amherst was reluctant to renovate the field. And so it was before the field renovation I was recruiting him to coach. And so I met him down at the field, and I see him looking at the field, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy played at North Carolina. He played in the Cape. He played at UConn, with all these great facilities. And now he's looking at this field and coming to Division III. There's no way he's going to take me up on the offer to pay him. I mean, we couldn't pay well at that time. So it was a couple $1,000 to be the pitching coach. And he took the job before I offered it. And he said, you know what? We had the conversation. We talked about our vision for the program and his role. And he said, Coach, I'm on board. Let's go and do this. And I want to go and say, Jordan, I didn't offer you the job. I still had interviews. But he was just so passionate about wanting to coach in our vision. So I was like, hey, let's do it. I kind of ran.
Hey, let them know you want the job. That's some of the best advice I've ever gotten. Brad Brownell is the basketball coach at Clemson. He and I grew up together, and I was interviewing for a job, and I called him, and he goes, hey, make sure they know you want the job. Just make sure, because don't assume anything. Get it out there and let them know that you actually want the job.
Yes. And so, he said he's taking the job, and I want to be like, well, I didn't offer it to you, but okay, let's go. And then I called up those other coaches, said, hey, we made an offer. But what makes Jordan special is what I've been really fortunate about. You asked me about, the coaches that I've had the good fortune of associating with. I've been fortunate to be around coaches who passionately love the game, love coaching and seeing players develop, and have an intimate relationship with their players in terms of just loving them and caring about them. And Jordan is all of that combined with, again, you want to talk about coaches that he's learned from at North Carolina and UConn and at
even John Wilson, he played for John Wilson, who's a longtime scout in New Jersey growing up. So, just
correct.
even that.
Great high school program. Speaking of outstanding high school programs. And then he went to Albany, and then Coach Courier at Fairfield, and then they made that run 2 years ago. And everywhere he's gone, he's developed outstanding pitching staffs. And now for him to go to FAU is going to be not only a great opportunity for him, but for that coaching staff as well. But again, you could say that I've been fortunate to be able to say that about every single coach who I've coached with on the coaching staff. And I've always, as a head coach, seen our coaching staffs, whether it's at Amherst or Eastern, now Yale, as every coach having their responsibility for the area that they're coaching, and they have full run with it. And I've had the luxury of having knowledgeable coaches, but to give them the responsibility to say, okay, Chris, like the pitching staff is yours. You're fully in charge of that. For them to then be able to embrace that and develop and cultivate their areas within the team has really been a successful model for me.
You talked about with your players at Eastern, talking about getting back to the World Series. Was it just that, or was it win a national championship? I mean, that's part of raising the expectations. And the history of the program was phenomenal. But when you get there, that's one of those things where you first start talking about right away, or did you let things develop before you started talking about it?
So when I arrived at Eastern, it was very clear that that's what Eastern baseball is about, winning national championships. And I was reminded many times by alumni that Eastern didn't celebrate. The number of times I heard Eastern doesn't celebrate conference championships or regional championships, I got the point, which is, okay, Eastern's about winning national championships. And with an organization that's won 5 of them, they can say that. They've earned that right. But because of that, we didn't have to talk about it as a team. And so we actually, this past year, never talked about it. And I've never believed in talking about outcome goals as much as performance and process goals, because the outcomes take care of themselves if you're able to bring in the talent and have the systems of development and the good leadership. What was really interesting is that, and again, when I do recruit and talk about that stuff. I'm very clear to recruits about reality. I don't sugarcoat things, and I certainly am very clear about why we bring a recruit in. So, for example, when we brought our transfers in, when I was on the phone with Ryan Bagdasarian or Donnie at Shore, I was very clear that they were coming in and they were going to play right away. They didn't need to earn their keep on the team. They had already done that and cut their teeth at UConn and where they were before. But I was also very clear that they were coming in to help us make a run to get to a College World Series. That's about the extent of what we talked about when it came to the World Series. What was really interesting is that as we got further along in the season and we started doing the post-game interviews, I was listening to our players talk about their goal to win a World Series. It had never been something that we had talked about as a team, but it was kind of this unsaid as to why players came into our program and why some of them returned, because many of them could have left after last year, but chose to come back because of what we had as a team and because of the sour taste in their mouth of the way that the season had ended. And so at the end of the year, we were in the World Series and doing some of the post-game press conferences, and John Masagno and Luke Broadhurst both mentioned that from the onset, they were about winning a World Series. And I know many teams talk about that, and it's easy to talk about it, but it's actually really impressive to be able to talk about it and then ultimately do it. And what's really interesting is that we have this profile at the beginning of the year that our sports information does on all of our players, and they're asked a number of different questions, from what your favorite food is to who your favorite major league player is. And one of the questions that was asked in that profile at the beginning of the year, before the season even started, was, what is your favorite lifetime moment? And both John Masagno and Luke Broadhurst separately, without knowing that the other person had answered the question in this way, answered winning the 2022 national championship, which is, I mean, if you think about it, is bizarre.
Love it.
But they had this conviction throughout the year, and then it began to materialize where, we only had 3 losses throughout the year, and we were rolling teams. I mean, we were a very, very talented team, and arguably I could look back at it and say we were probably the most talented Division III baseball team in the country this year. And so, how often does the most talented, and again, Marietta, very good, Salisbury, very good, Baldwin Wallace, LaGrange, I mean, outstanding teams. So not
Salisbury's only returning team. You know, that was cool for me because there were so many new teams this year that weren't there the year before. That was awesome for me, and I love the guys at Salisbury as well. You know, that was neat for me because, like, okay, there's only one returning team. This thing's probably going to be wide open, so it's good.
Yes, and so for arguably the most talented team, if not, you know, one of the top 2 or 3 most talented teams in Division III baseball, to then win it all was really special. But you didn't know that at the start of the season. So that was fun for me to see the conviction that these guys had, the belief that we were good, without it being arrogance, was refreshing for me. A lot of that was out of ignorance or out of innocence on their part, and probably ignorance too, of the lack of appreciation of how hard it is to win a College World Series, right? Like if you're one of those guys on the team this year, you're like, oh, this is easy, like, you know. But you and I both know how hard it is to do.
And at Division III, which has the most teams. You know, that was something that Dan Hammis and I talked about on the podcast, is the amount of teams that are at Division III. It's much larger than any of the other divisions.
Yes, and one of the things that has changed in Division III, and I noticed it this year, and it's a product of COVID, it's a product of the transfer portal, it's a product of the NCAA granting 2 years of extended eligibility, is that the teams that I noticed in the College World Series, and some of the better teams that we played in the regular season, are so talented now. Yeah. The talent on the field, you were at the World Series, the physicality of some of these teams. And you watch, my wife and I watched the All-Star game together, and her remark was how massive the players on the field were in the All-Star game. Well, you could say the same thing. Now, again, not the same size as
that was Stanton, what stuck out to me this year. Was I went to multiple championships. Physically, there's not a lot of difference anymore, where in the past, you'd go watch a Division I game, then you'd go watch a Division III game. You could see body type differences. You just don't see it as much anymore. You don't see those body type differences.
Because of the access now that Division III teams have at acquiring players from the Division I level. Yep. And then also what the transfer portal has done is it's now made Division III players accessible to Division I, and vice versa. And so what we're starting to learn now is that the better players out of Division III and the better teams of Division III, there's significantly more overlap with Division I. Yes. There's always been that, but now I think there are more teams, and it's at a higher level in terms of where these top level Division III players can play. And if you start to look at the players after the season who have gone from Division III that are now are going to be on Division I rosters because of the access of the transfer portal, you're starting to realize the quality of the top tier of Division III baseball. And you saw that really play out at the World Series. And so, again, I think it goes back to how remarkable this season was for Eastern to be able to do what they did up against the parity that now exists within Division III is really special. And again, it's really good for the game, because now you have Division I players who unfortunately are now losing, they buy into Division I program, and because of the transfer portal, there's just so much now players moving within teams, which is now causing players who came into these teams to look around and say, okay, well, the landscape on this team has changed from when I was recruited here. I'm going to look to play elsewhere. Well, that's happening now throughout Division I. And so maybe the opportunity isn't at Division I, but it's now at the Division III level, and vice versa. Now there are Division III players who are saying, okay, I've been able to be successful at the Division III level. I have the ability not only to play at the Division I level, to play at high level Division I and have success there. That's really good for the game. I think at first glance, so many coaches and players are going to say, well, that's a negative outcome of the transfer portal. But in some respects, it's really good for the game in that it now allows for players to have more access to Division I by coming up through Division III or Division II.
And also for coaches, by the way, because, 5, 10 years ago, probably not going to see a Division III coach get an opportunity to go coach Division I. So I think it's helping everybody in that respect. And congrats, because that rarely happens. I mean,
Yes.
I've been around college baseball my entire life, and very rarely happens. We're seeing it with junior college coaches again, getting a chance to do Division I, and now we've got this, and which is tremendous. So I'm very grateful, thankful for you that you get this opportunity, because it very rarely happens.
Well, and we saw a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit, with college coaches getting plucked to go into Major League Baseball, into the professional organizations. There was that run of about a year and a half where all of a sudden, Tucker Frawley.
It seemed like everybody. It was like, holy cow, there's another one.
Yes.
There's another one.
And again, I also think that that's good for the game, because not only does it now connect college baseball with professional baseball, which there needs to be more of that from an instructional perspective. In Major League Baseball, recognizing, wait a second, down at the college level, there's some really good things going on in terms of the level of instruction coming from the coaches.
Well, look at the draft now, the amount of Division I players that were drafted this year as opposed to every other level. Like, again, it's your closest route to the big leagues is to play Division I baseball.
Yes, but then also now for the opportunity for high school coaches to come into the college ranks as well, and opening doors there. It's the game is changing, and again, at first glance, some people will say that it's not good for the game, and I think long term we're going to see that this is really good for the game.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have a fail forward moment? Do you have something you thought was going to sidetrack you, but looking back now was one of the best things that happened to you? Everybody has to answer this one. Could be personal, could be professional. It's a wide open question, but everybody has to answer this one.
So I'm a big believer in finding opportunities from setbacks. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the game of baseball, and that's life. I would say. I would say that it was losing, getting walked off against Southern Maine in our conference tournament as the 1 seed, having an amazing season. We won the first game in the 3-game series. We were up 5 runs. We were up 5-0 in that final game in the 6th inning. And to their credit, they came from behind. And it's funny, Chris and I in the dugout in that moment. So we were facing Seymour, who was the freshman of the year in the conference that year. And there was a runner at second, and we were just debating whether or not to pitch to him. And the wind was actually blowing across the field. He's a left-handed hitter. It was blowing across the field. And we thought to ourselves, okay, and he's a pull hitter. And we were thinking to ourselves, do we pitch to him or not? And we'd been able to get him out the entire series and the entire year. We knew, kind of had the cheat code on how to get him out. And we ultimately decided to pitch to him. And as a matter of fact, it was Nate Farino, who I'd mentioned, had been a great teammate this year because he didn't play down the stretch, having been an all-New England player and pitcher last year. So you have an all-New England pitcher on the mound. You're at home. The wind is blowing against the left-handed hitter where he hits it to his power alley. We had the cheat code on him, runner at second. We said, let's pitch to him. We threw a change up, and it just got a little bit too much of the plate. And go figure, he hits it out to left. And wind dated home. I mean, he got it, but the wind certainly helped it. So we got walked off there. Then we went to the NCAA tournament, faced Merchant Marine in an all-American lefty pitcher, and got beat in that game in a really close game, and then lost it. And then so you have the 1 seed and the 2 seed in the tournament because Cortland had lost. They got upset to Tufts, playing in the losers bracket on day 2, and we lost a good game there. And so all of a sudden we got bounced. And we could have used that. That could have certainly, that season could have been, okay, we had a good year. We were 32-8 and rest on our laurels. And I really do believe that the biggest challenge to teams are those seasons. Those seasons where you go 32-8 and you look back and say, oh, we had a good season, right? We finished second in our conference. We went to the NCAA tournament. You pat yourself on the back and you say, oh, we got a bunch of guys return next year. We're going to be really good. Or you could use that as motivation in the off season. And so I think that those are the years that you have to be really, really careful about. These years, you have the good years that aren't enough motivation for you to develop. And to our players' credit, they worked so hard in the off season to be prepared for this year. and to use that as motivation. And then I had mentioned that game against Middlebury in the regional. And there were so many close games, and when you only lose 3 games, there are a number of games that you're behind, or that things aren't going your way, that you figure a way out of being up against the ropes.
Winning ugly. I mean, that's what teams that have great years is they find ways to win ugly.
Yes, and they did a really good job of that. And I think that was our moment for us, because it taught us, and myself as a coach, it reminded me that oftentimes it's the setbacks are the open windows to develop yourself and ultimately to find a successful way out of it. So yeah, that would be my fail forward moment.
Do you have any evening or morning routines that you do that you like, that you stay pretty consistent? I mean, you seem like you're in good shape and energy level's good. Do you have any set routines?
Yeah. You wouldn't know because I'm sweating bullets here. It's really hot in here in Connecticut, and my wife and I have this really old house without air conditioning, and so I'm sweating bullets here. So you wouldn't think that I'm in good shape. I've been really fortunate to be given the work ethic from my family and from people like Bill Thurston that I really love to work. As a matter of fact, John Stuper, I texted him this morning. He and I have become really, really close over the past couple of weeks. And he texted me this morning and said, "Do you ever sleep?" And I wrote back, "No," because I enjoy being up more than I do sleeping. But I remember you'll appreciate this. And for people who know Bill Thurston, and I'm sure many of the older guard ABCA members remember him and kind of remember his personality. He would always get into the office before me. He'd always get in the office at 7 a.m. So what I did was, as an young assistant coach, I would try to beat him to the office. So he got in at 7, I'd get in at 6:59. Well, he didn't appreciate that. So he would get in at 6:55 the next day, and then I'd get in at 6:54. And it got to the point where we were getting in the office at 6 a.m. But before I had figured that out, I'd get into the office, 7:30 in the morning, he'd already be there. And whenever I'd walk into the office, he'd always look up at the clock. It just is kind of a little tell, hey, I beat you in this morning. And it got to the point where, and again, so many coaches who've coached with him would appreciate this. When we'd walk down the hall, going to practice or wherever, he'd always need to be a step ahead of you a little bit. So myself and the other assistants would always play with him and walk a little bit faster. And he would speed up. And, by the end of it, we're both jogging down the hall. But I think you ask about routines. I just love to work. I love the game. I'm fortunate to be around so many at Yale, brilliant minds and baseball players who love the game, think the game the way that I do and that I want to, and our assistant coaches, that's what fuels me to do what I do. And, people like yourself and all the ABCA coaches and everybody who's involved, the game of baseball is so special. And I know you could say this about other sports, but we do such a great job of sharing information. That's one of the things I love about the game. It's one of the things that's most special to the game about the ABCA is the sharing of information. This podcast, hopefully being an example of that. I don't know how much wealth of information I spread today, but
a lot.
It's that what fuels coaches and myself to then do all the little things. I went back, I mentioned Coach Thurston saying that you have to enjoy the work in the game. Well, same thing goes with coaching or anything in life that you have to work hard at. You have to find the pleasure in that. And I've been really fortunate to be able to do that in coaching and then be fueled by interacting with people who are equally passionate about it. Those are kind of my routines. I don't sleep much, and I'm fueled by, I get the energy from kind of that excitement about being around people and learning.
Do you have any organizational or time management hacks?
Time management advice, you said?
Yeah, do you have any hacks? It's your stressful job coaching and a lot of hoops, a lot of fires to put out at times. Do you have anything that you go to time management wise? Calendar, what are you using calendar wise?
Yeah, so I'm actually really getting into Outlook. There's so this is actually a time management piece of advice. Outlook now has a taskbar that you can, as part of an app on the Office profile, that can allow you to assign tasks not only to yourself but the other people who have in shared Outlook. And so, for example, like with my assistant coaches, I'm able to then give them tasks through that they can check on if they're on the road in Georgia or recruiting elsewhere. That I found is really good in terms of time management. But I'll say the thing that I've learned most about coaching at Division I level, compared to having been at Eastern and Amherst, you have to say no a lot more.
Yes.
I'm getting good at that. It's there's so many people who ask something of you,
Yes.
and unfortunately you can't help them all out, and you got to get good at saying no. It's
Yes.
one of the things that I've learned over the past 3 weeks.
Have you ever gotten bad advice? You've been surrounded by great mentors and people. Have you ever gotten bad advice?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I think when you get bad advice, you have to learn from it,
Yeah.
and understand why you didn't, why that was bad advice, right? Because oftentimes, so I just had a conversation with Noberto, the recruiting coordinator out of Miami. Great guy, done a phenomenal job down there. And we were down in Georgia last week at East Cobb, and we were watching a game, and I asked him about Scotty Tenen, who's the coach of the team that we were playing. Such a good coach, and has so many talented players on the team. And I turned to Noberto and I said, do you ever take a coach's, you have to be so many places at once. Do you ever take a coach's advice on a player without seeing the player and commit to that player? And he said, no, my livelihood is on the line by evaluating players. I have to go watch that player, and I have to sit eyes on him. As good as a coach or a strong relationship that I've had, or the fact that he's always sent me talented players, and never been wrong in that regard, I still have to verify. And that caused me to think about getting advice. And I think this applies to your question about bad advice, which is, I think when you get bad advice, if you fail because of it, it's ultimately on you. For not verifying the information that you got in the advice, right? Because advice, ultimately, at the end of the day, is just a suggestion.
Yeah, and everybody's perspective is different. So,
Correct.
like, they're giving advice from their perspective,
Correct.
which you could come to a completely different outcome because your path, all the other things that come with that are different. So, like, from their perspective, they're giving you good advice, but it may not work for you because your situation might be completely different.
Exactly, right. And so, especially for head coaches,
Yes.
It's really important to take that advice. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's your decision.
Yes.
Right. Whether it's to move on a player or to make, you talk about the pitch that we called the change up to Seymour that lost us the conference championship.
But by the way, if that pitch is executed better, it's not a home run. Like a hanging
That
changeup's going to go out of the ballpark. So, like, probably the right call on that pitch just wasn't executed well.
Certainly, right. And it's funny because Chris, our pitching coach, is one of the best pitch callers in the game, Division I, II, or III, and he was beating himself up for calling that pitch because we were deciding to either throw the ball off the plate or just intentionally walk him with the four signed to the umpire, and we chose to throw the pitch. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we also have to take into account the fact that it might be, especially at Division III level, not located properly.
Yeah.
And Chris was really eating himself up for ultimately that decision. But at the end of the day, that was my decision to let him make that decision, right? And as head coaches, I often remind myself that I'm playing with live ammo in terms of decisions that I make. And going back to the advice piece, like, advice is only bad advice until you make the decision to use it, right? But up till that moment, it's just advice. And it's yours to choose how you decide to move forward with it. And one of the things that I try to remind myself as a head coach is that you have all, and we tell our players this. I'm sorry for using two gun references. Maybe I got to find ways to explain this better. But you always have. I won't use a gun reference because I can use. I guess it's another aggressive.
That's all right. Let it rip.
Bear with me here. You always have the power before you ultimately pull your punch, right? And it's that moment of, kind of pulling back. I'll use another metaphor, pulling back of the bow,
Yep.
that you have the power. It's the moment that you release it, that you lose all the power.
Yes.
Now, you may be correct in the decision that you made or the releasing of the arrow to hit the target. But at that moment of release, that moment you make the decision, you lose all the power that you held up until that moment. And I really use that as a guide for our players in the decisions that they make in life, whether it's on a Friday night or it's in a game, that's to have that power before you make a decision or before you choose an action, which again translates to the game itself, right? Like as hitters, like that moment that we can load and hold ourselves from engaging. The longer that we can wait to then ultimately make that engagement, then ultimately, leads to more bat speed, more efficiency, and ultimately more power. The same thing goes, and I don't know how I got onto this when you asked me about bad advice, but ultimately it's how long can we hold ourselves in the moment before choosing to do something. And then sometimes
It's
if we
that
act too
pause
quickly,
before action. That's
yeah,
always an important piece. Is
absolutely.
there's going to be something that happens, pause, or maybe no pause, and then a reaction. And usually a quick trigger reaction doesn't end very well
No,
for someone.
that's ultimately when advice becomes bad advice,
Yes.
right? So to answer your question, I've never received bad advice.
Yeah.
I've just made bad decisions on advice that I got.
Yeah. Love it. What are some final thoughts, or maybe something I should have asked you that I didn't?
First of all, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you and to be a part of this podcast. Thanks for doing that, and thanks for the opportunity to do it. I would. You've asked me some really good questions. The question unasked. I'll say this: if people haven't seen it, it's actually a really cool thing. If you go back to watching the last out of our World Series game, and you watch the pitcher Tommy Benicasso, and Tommy's story is a wonderful story. He was a walk-on at UConn, became their bullpen catcher just because he wanted to be a part of the game and didn't make it as a walk-on. Signed away his eligibility there because Josh McDonald's such an outstanding pitching coach. One day he was throwing BP to some of the UConn hitters, and they recognized that he could actually become a pitcher, and they transitioned him to a pitcher. But because he didn't have any eligibility at Division I level, he came down and pitched for us. He ended up being the pitcher to close out the World Series for us. He is such a passionate person and loves his teammates, loves the game, loves winning. And it gives you, in the story I'm telling, gives you a sense of the passion that he has, but also what we were as a team in that moment. And that actually, when he went into the last inning, the first two pitches that he threw, I turned to Woj and said, "This game's over." By the two pitches that he executed, no disrespect to Salisbury, incredible team and outstanding hitters. But you knew at that moment, and we were only up one, that there was like Tommy Benicasso and our team on the field was going to do everything possible to prevent the other team from winning. And we also felt that we had better pitchers than our opponents' hitters and better defense. And again, no disrespect to our opponents. It's just what we thought we were. The last pitch that he throws for the last out, it's a chopper over his head, and he reaches for it, goes over his head. The ball hasn't even been fielded yet by our second baseman, Noah Plantamura, an outstanding defensive player. And Tommy Benicasso is already spiking his glove as if the game were over. And you see Tommy spiking the glove, but you see in the background Noah Plantamura fielding it. He hasn't even thrown it. It hasn't even been caught yet. And how many times do you see in moments like that where the other team, the team that's in that moment succumbs to the pressure and throws the ball away? And you can look at it again from a perspective of that's disrespectful to the game and the opponents. The game isn't even over yet. Or you can look at it from the perspective of here's somebody with sheer joy in that moment that everything's worked toward.
And trust his teammates. You're in the moment.
And the trust.
You trust your teammate that he's going to make that play.
Yes, and you trust the work that we had put into that season. And again, going to all the mental preparation and the centering that we do as a team, that we weren't affected by those big moments, that we were able to execute what it was, a very routine play, and him knowing that and having the trust in his teammates to be able to do that, combined with just the sheer joy of that moment, that everything he had worked toward, not just at Eastern in that year, but the path through high school. And he has a wonderful family story of, he has two other brothers that have they're really, really close, and they came and followed him through, the entire run. But then everything that he did at UConn, and all that he brought from UConn to Eastern in that moment of just sheer joy. So he rock spikes his glove, and the game's still being played out. Those are one of those moments, again, kind of going back to the innocence of youth, to kind of just watch play out on the field. That would have never happened if it weren't for everything, again, that the NCAA and the ABCA and Eastern Connecticut and the 7 other teams that were there, and the umpires and all of the coaches of Division III baseball who were part of the championship committee. Mike Lindbergh, who, I know this was his last year, everything that he's done with the NCAA and the Ncaa Tournament, and then the gracious hosts and Cedar Rapids, all of that coming together to then observe in that moment for those guys was, I think, certainly worth going back and watching it, because it's kind of a cool thing if you're a fan of baseball and college baseball.
Love it. Thanks for your time, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Heck yeah.